Hello, my name is Sam Knights. I'm a barrister specialising in refugee law. I'm an adjunct at the University of Miami, where I co-teach a course on international human rights law, and also an alum of Somerville College, where I read modern history. I am sitting right now at home in an extremely wet Devon, but delighted to see we have participants from all over, including some far-flung places. And I'm thrilled that Somerville has been so nimble in taking its events online and making them publicly and freely available at this time. The webinar is being recorded and will be streamed on the YouTube channel as well. Tonight's event, Dignity, Safety, Survival, the Rights of Refugees in a Lockdown, is one of two Somerville at Home events, specifically programmed to coincide with Refugee Week, in order to raise awareness about the complicated issues, legal, social, political and public health relating to refugees. I have two wonderful experts in this field that I'm going to introduce in just a minute, whom I'll be in conversation with. Before I do that, I want to draw attention to two initiatives introduced by Somerville. The first is the Refugee Scholarship, which was inaugurated earlier this year, which will offer a fully funded place of postgraduate study to its first student in October 2020. And there are plans to extend this to undergraduate students in due course. The second is the ongoing bid of Somerville College to be recognised as a college of sanctuary, in a scheme that will see Somerville develop the systems and culture to ensure it offers a welcoming and accessible environment to refugees and asylum seekers from all over the globe. And this could not be more important right now. I want to also add, by way of introduction, my own trajectory into refugee law began in the immediate aftermath of my time at Somerville. As with many graduating students in modern history, I wasn't entirely sure what on earth I was going to do. But I spied a job in the Careers Bulletin, which took me to Estonia as a journalist working for an English language newspaper. And I was phoned one day in the office in Tallinn by a prison guard who told me that there were a number of people sitting in his prison who he didn't think should be there and that I should come. So I arrived at the prison a few hours later. I was met by him and ushered into a completely bare room with a large number of Iraqi women and children, as it transpired, who had paid over $10,000 a person to human traffickers to take them to Sweden. Unfortunately for them, they were dumped on the shores of Estonia, which at the time in 1994 had not signed the Refugee Convention, and therefore they were treated as unlawfully on the territory of the country. I interviewed them, and I interviewed the Minister for Home Affairs, and I wrote up the piece for Reuters. But I left with this distinct sense that they needed lawyers rather than a journalist. Anyway, many years later, following a short stint in bankruptcy law, I arrived at Matrix, where I am today practicing in this area. But that experience of meeting those refugees in Estonia has remained with me, because it highlights the many political as well as legal barriers that refugees face, as well as the lack of understanding by many who were reporting in this area about the international and domestic legal framework. I certainly did not know anything about international refugee law or Estonian refugee law, for that matter, at the time. The current pandemic is obviously a very difficult time for all of us, but we can already see very clearly that some categories of people are far more severely impacted than others. Those who are living in conflict zones, those living as displaced persons, those living in camps, those who are victims of violence, abuse, or any form of servitude or slavery, or who are homeless or living in poverty, are far more at risk than those who have settled status in a country, accommodation, means of support, and food. And the border closures during the pandemic, the increased restrictions on border control, obviously exacerbate the difficulties that those seeking protection would ordinarily face. There are also huge problems for those who are living in camps or those who are in immigration detention facilities in terms of social distancing, ensuring that they're protected from the virus, as well as for those who are working with them in those environments. And states have responded very differently in terms of how they deal with asylum seekers, how they process claims at this time, whether they're even hearing appeals. Some countries have stopped these processes altogether, leaving asylum seekers in limbo in situations where they just simply have no access to support. Before we begin, I just wanted to highlight the figures, because they are striking. The global number of refugees and displaced peoples is very large indeed. And the recent figures given by the UNHCR, the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees, is that over 70 million people have been forcibly displaced. That figure includes 26 million refugees, and that about 85% of refugees are hosted by developing countries. Whereas if we turn to the figures for the UK, for example, as a developed country, the numbers of refugees in the UK are in fact incredibly small, about 126,000. That's about 0.26% of the population. So these are facts which often surprise people who don't work day to day in this area. So I want to turn now to our panellists for this evening, Alison Harvey and Professor Alexander Betts. The last time we were all together, in fact, was 2 years ago, I think, at All Souls College for a symposium on refugees organised by Professor Guy Goodwin-Gill. Alex was then ahead of the times as he presented his talk via a recorded video session, which I thought was remarkably innovative, and of course now seems the norm. So we still haven't, in fact, met in person. Alex is Professor of Forced Migration and International Affairs and the William Golding Senior Fellow in Politics at Brasenose College, an Associate Head of the Social Science Division at Oxford, and also attached to the Refugee Studies Centre. Between 2014 and 17, he was director of that centre at Oxford, and his research focuses mainly on the political economy of refugee assistance. He's co-author with Paul Collier of Refuge, Transforming a Broken Refugee System, amongst many other books. And turning next to Alison, Alison's been working in the field of refugee and immigration law for almost her entire working life. She's a graduate of Merton College, was then called to the bar, became the General Secretary of the Immigration Law Practitioners Association from 2007 to 13, and then became its legal director. And it was in this position that she became a completely formidable forefront of an organisation which is really the first port of call for practitioners, but also people who are policymakers, people who are doing research in this area. And it produces position papers, it comments on legislation as it's passing through the two houses, writes case comments. And Alison has always been an absolute mine of information in this area. She's now, I'm very happy to say, back in practice as a barrister at No. 5 Chambers, and therefore practicing directly in the area of refugee, immigration, nationality, trafficking and modern slavery, amongst other areas. I've known Alison for many, many years, and she's always my first point of call for advice and thinking on any related subject to do with litigation and case law and policy in this area. So we have on our panel a lovely combination of political, socio-economic and legal thinking. What we're going to do is we're going to start off with me putting some questions to the panellists, and for about half an hour, and then we're going to open up to questions from all of you. So please do start putting your questions into the question box, and you can actually vote for each other's questions. If you see a question that you particularly like, you can upvote it. And you can also, if you see down the right-hand side, you've got the chat box for saying something nice. You don't need to say anything other than something nice, but that's for you to ask questions or say something nice about your time at college or whatever, wherever you are in the world, or if you've got a logistical question about this evening or something else. So I'm going to kick off now with some sort of basic questions so that we all are on the same page, because this area is complex and the terminology is complex. And I'm going to ask Alison, first of all, to tell us who is a refugee? What is the definition of a refugee? And can you explain what's meant by the different terms refugee, asylum seeker, and internally displaced person?
Yes, a refugee is someone who is outside of their country of nationality and afraid to return to it because of a fear that is well-founded of persecution for reason of their religion, nationality, race, membership of a social group, or political opinion. So we see that you have to be outside of your country to be a refugee. Also, what matters is the future, to be afraid of going back. That maybe that nothing happened to you before you fled, but there is a risk on return. Equally, you may be fleeing dreadful treatment, but if you are not at risk on return, you will not be recognised as a refugee. An asylum seeker, therefore, is someone who is asking to be recognised as a refugee for the period between that request and a state recognising that they are indeed someone who qualifies as a refugee. So the class of asylum seeker will include many people who are refugees, as well as people who, when their claims are determined, are found not to meet that definition. For example, they have fled terrible circumstances, but there is no risk when they go back. An internally displaced person is the term given to people who are still within the border of their country. They haven't managed to cross an international border. And of course, you can be internally displaced for lots of reasons. There are people internally displaced now in the UK by the pandemic. But we are specifically here looking at the people who are identified as persons of concern to UNHCR. So people displaced within their own country who, were they to cross the border, would likely be refugees.
Alison, thank you. That's incredibly helpful. Not least because one often sees in newspapers, in the media, terms such as a bogus asylum seeker or false asylum seeker, which actually have no legal meaning at all. You are an asylum seeker, and as you say, there is a process, and then there is a determination as to whether or not you, in fact, are a refugee. Alex, I'm going to turn to you next, and again ask a sort of, what a practical question, but one that's important for us to understand at the outset. How is it that refugees cross borders in practice? Alison's told us you have to cross an international border to become a refugee. How do they cross borders in practice? And why do they have to pay smugglers? And why do they have to use false documents to do this?
Yes, this is one of the big challenges with the definition of a refugee that Alison laid out, that it's not only having a well-founded fear of persecution based on one of the grounds that she highlighted, it's also being outside the country of nationality. And of course, to be outside your country of nationality, you have to have been able to cross the border. And in some parts of the world, that's easier than in others. In much of the developing worlds, low and middle income countries, there are relatively porous borders. So it's less challenging to cross a border from a fragile or failed state or a country where there's conflict, often into the immediate neighboring country. And that's one of the reasons why, as you said at the start, Sam, 85% of the world's refugees are in low and middle income countries. It's because most of them simply cross into the neighboring countries. Those neighboring countries are not disproportionately generous for the most part. They just, because of geography, happen to be next door to crisis and conflict states, and often those borders are porous. But to move onwards then from those immediate neighbors to rich countries is very challenging. You can't move very easily by getting on an aeroplane unless you have both a passport and in many cases a visa. And we don't create mechanisms where refugees can go to embassies very easily and say, I would like to travel to the United Kingdom or Europe or the US, please give me a visa. And when I get there, I will claim that I'm a refugee and enter an asylum process. It doesn't happen that way. And so the contradiction, if you like, in the system is that you have to be able to cross a border. And once you get into a particular country and you're successfully recognized as a refugee, you have a right called non-refoulement, a right not to be returned to a country where you face some threshold of serious harm. But getting into that country is a different question. And many countries try to avoid incurring responsibility for protecting refugees by creating all kinds of mechanisms of what are called non-entree, preventing people getting into those countries in the first place. So those refugees are some other country's responsibility. We see those dynamics in Europe where the UK wants it to be France's responsibility, France wants it to be Italy's responsibility, and further down the channel, Italy wants it to be Libya's responsibility, etc., etc. And so with these very difficult, challenging border regimes, the last resort is smugglers, and having to pay huge amounts of money to usually organized gangs to provide safe and indeed often dangerous passage across territorial waters, across different parts of the Mediterranean, central Mediterranean, from the Maghreb countries to Malta and Italy, the Aegean Sea, as we've seen in 2015 and 16, from Turkey to Greece, the Western Mediterranean, from the Canary Islands into Spain, or indeed over land, as we see often from Central America into the United States or elsewhere in the world. And these are very expensive services, sometimes costing thousands of dollars or pounds, sometimes requiring people to commit to work or break up their journey over a number of months or years. And those smuggling networks are still operating now, even in the context of the pandemic. They thrive off being sufficiently innovative to find ways of crossing borders, but the risks and human costs get ever greater with the challenge of surmounting those border regimes.
Right. I mean, one of the striking things for me when I met the refugees in Estonia was, in fact, that they were actually quite middle class. You know, in the sense that they had all been able, the whole family had been paying $10,000 a piece. So the women and the children were in one prison, the men were actually in another prison. But very often you find that only a single male will be the only person that will be able to cross, because this is just absolutely out of the means of most families to be able to pay that sort of price to smuggle. Alison, I wanted to bring you in and ask you whether you wanted to add anything about the various ways in particular that historically the UK has just made it much more difficult for refugees to reach this country. One obviously thinks back to a period in the 19th century when there were effectively open borders and no passports. And gradually what we've seen from the early 20th century onwards is just increasing controls. But do you want to say something about that, and also about legally whether refugees can be penalised for using false documents to get across an international border to claim asylum?
The UK is an island, which makes it easier for us to keep people out. They're likely to be arriving by boat or plane. And what we, like many other countries, have done is to try to export our border. So it's the point at which you get onto a plane that you are stopped. And not only have we exported our border, but we've privatised it. So it is the airline official who checks your documents. And the airline official is very careful, because if he or she gets it wrong, the airline is fined for bringing a person who does not have the right documentation. The airline does get a refund if you are recognised as a refugee. But as you can imagine, a private company is going to be risk averse. So if you haven't got the right document, they're not going to be very interested in whether you're a refugee or not. You can't get on the aeroplane. And that is one of the means by which we export our border. Clearly, we also bring our border inside. So if you cross into the UK in the back of a lorry, nonetheless, you may be discovered when you try to get employment or claim a social benefit. So if you were a person who hadn't brought yourself to the attention of the authorities, the rest of us are co-opted in our roles as employers or university lecturers to find you and make it difficult for you to stay, what is often described on the billboards as the hostile environment, which can affect a refugee because, of course, if you don't have faith in the state's asylum system or don't know very much about it, you might think better that I stay in the country with my head down and at least I'm physically safe than throw myself on the mercy of the state and say, please recognise me as a refugee. So government ministers will often say a genuine refugee claims asylum at the earliest possible opportunity. throws him or herself into the arms of the first immigration officer encountered. But that's only true if you have faith in the system. The Refugee Convention is very aware, therefore, that as well as physically hiding, you may well be travelling on false documents. And the Refugee Convention specifies that you shan't be penalised for using false documents, provided you present yourself on arrival in the destination country without delay and don't maintain subterfuge. That has been interpreted in the UK literally to mean you have to present yourself to the first immigration officer, so that if you think, well, at least I'll get out of the airport, find someone I know or find a lawyer, and then I'll go back to the authorities. If you do that a couple of days later, it may be said that you didn't claim at the first possible opportunity. And you will then find not that your claim for asylum will be treated differently, but that you may be disadvantaged in terms of social benefits or other ways.
Yes, and this brings up this very interesting question of, on the one hand, you have these international norms. You just highlighted the Refugee Convention, which prevents people from being penalised using false documents. But on the other hand, you have domestic law, and it's the states themselves which both interpret the convention and then pass a whole series of measures which are primary legislation and the primary way in which refugees are dealt with in that particular state. And I know in the US, for example, it's not nearly as protective in terms of not penalising refugees who come in on false documents. But I also wanted, again, to pick up on this idea that you talked about of there being no legal way to get to the UK as a refugee. There's no visa that you can apply for. You have to either, as Alex spoke about, you either have to pay smugglers or cross a border covertly, or come in, for example, on a different type of visa and then change once you're in the country and make your claim for asylum. But practically and legally, there are enormous barriers for people making asylum claims. Alex, I want to turn now to looking at the pandemic in particular, and wonder whether you could speak with your sort of, especially given the Refugee Studies Centre and the seminars that you've been doing there, about the problems that refugees are facing specifically in the pandemic.
Yeah, it's been very interesting following, particularly through our research networks in East Africa and elsewhere, the global effect of the pandemic on refugees. And I think the impact is very much at three different levels. The immediate health impact, secondly, the impact of lockdown and all of the protection implications that has, and thirdly, the real implications to come, which are through the global recession that is likely to follow and the economic impact that will have. So, I mean, just to reflect a little bit on each of those, I think the virus itself has had relatively few consequences for most refugee camps and urban contexts which have large numbers of refugees. Now, I don't want to trivialize the importance of the public health impact, because in refugee camps, there aren't possibilities for social distancing in the same ways we have here. We have very densely populated areas that are very vulnerable to a significant public health impact. And there have been challenges often of misinformation, difficulties of international NGOs and international organizations being able to provide basic support like access to information, soap, basic amenities, increased health capacity. So I think on a health level, particularly in refugee camps, there have been real risks and challenges of assistance that have come from international organization staff often leaving, NGOs suspending missions to refugee camps, etc. So it's important, and some camps have been affected at a health level. But I think the impact we've seen most of so far is really through lockdown practices. And that's had different impacts in different parts of the world. We've seen lockdown and quarantine practices lead to a whole range of consequences for people's movement. We see internal mobility restrictions around the world. We see restrictions on people's ability to exit countries and enter countries. And all of those consequences for mobility have been very significant. So to give you some examples, in the East African context, where we do a lot of work, in cities like Nairobi and Kampala, cities where refugees don't have much assistance, as they tend not to in urban areas. Refugees have been historically reliant on their own networks, access to remittances, and the informal economy. Lockdown has suspended effectively activity in the informal economy. It's meant that remittances have declined dramatically, and that's left many refugees really struggling. Some governments have announced that refugees have no access to government food assistance, and so many refugees have faced quite literal starvation. So cities where refugees don't have assistance have been a massive problem, and there have been huge consequences. In terms of people moving from those low and middle income countries onwards to rich countries, simply moving to claim asylum has been extremely difficult. And some of the practices, in many cases covert practices, adopted by countries in Europe, the United States, elsewhere, have really used the subterfuge of the focus on COVID-19 to crack down on refugee movements and entry. And in many cases, they've used the excuse, if you like, of public health measures to legitimate really restrictive border practices. So we've seen pushbacks in the Italy-Libya context, in Malta, on the Greek islands, with the US restricting entry on the US-Mexican border, with the potential deportations of Haitians. A lot of governments are doubling down on really problematic border control practices and using public health measures as the excuses. So lockdown has created an environment that has had impacts in cities, in camps, and for people's mobility. But the third area that I think has been underplayed is around the impact of the coming global recession. We know that there's going to be a dramatic effect. The prediction, even for 2020, is that we'll see a 3% shrinkage at minimum in the global economy. And that's going to have the most serious effects amongst many of the poorest countries in the world, and have even greater effects, we know, on refugee communities. So we know from past social science research that it will affect the causes of forced displacement. It will exacerbate conflict, authoritarianism. It will have its worst effects on fragile states. So the numbers of people displaced are likely to be increased by global recession. But we also know in terms of the consequences that it will affect many of the things that support refugees. It will lead to potentially declining assistance as aid budgets shrink. And we've seen this week the government announced DFID being integrated with the FCO, which is probably going to be an example of a backward step in terms of aid. We've seen a more than 20% decline in remittances predicted by the World Bank. So all the things that support refugees, even their own livelihoods activities, are going to be dramatically affected as the informal economy shrinks. The consequences are going to hit refugees very hard. But also in terms of responses by governments, we see those restrictive practices that often emerge in recessions. Times like the financial crisis of 2008 to 9 led to shrinking protection space for refugees around the world, including in Europe and North America. So the virus, serious, but not necessarily just the public health consequences matter. It's also lockdown and the recession, where the socioeconomic consequences will have a devastating effect in terms of increasing needs, exacerbating the consequences, and potentially undermining the willingness of governments to protect people.
Yes, and we've seen, I mean, across the board in Europe, although in theory there is a common legal framework for receiving refugees, receiving asylum seekers, processing claims, and giving them support and assistance, in practice, the way it's interpreted is very different. And of course, as you say, the pandemic will exacerbate these differences. I want to come back to this whole issue of the border control and the legality of it, because there is this interesting tension. On the one hand, under law to be able to claim asylum, the right to asylum. And yet, on the other hand, under international law, the right of states to control their borders. Alison, can you talk about how these two competing legal rights sit with each other? What about the person who arrives at the border? The person who is pushed back from ever getting to the border, is that legal? The person who's pushed back in international waters from getting to a country, do they have an argument under international law to be allowed to get to the border? And does it make any difference that we're in a pandemic? Are the state arguments about control stronger and trump cards in a pandemic?
That's a lot of questions. It is quite a complicated picture. Alex used the word non-refoulement, and that is the basic obligation under the Refugee Convention, that where you have a person who asks for your protection, you are under an obligation not to send them back to face persecution. And that includes not sending them back until you've determined whether they're someone who needs your protection or not. So you can't send back the asylum seeker or the refugee. We don't just use the French word to be awkward. Refouler in French is more than returning people. It covers removal, transfer, rejection. It covers removal of admission. So although the convention only protects you once you are outside your country, UNHCR would certainly take the view that once you get to an international border, a place where another state exercises jurisdiction, an immigration officer is exercising jurisdiction to let you through or not let you through, that the state's obligations under the Refugee Convention are involved. It gets even more complicated when you are on water, on the sea. Each state has territorial waters to the distance of 12 miles from the coast. You then have something called a contiguous zone of a further 12 miles. And as you can imagine, in the Mediterranean, there's not much room for high seas left after that. You're crossing from one state to another. But you then have the high seas, and different obligations have been held to apply in different places. The first difficulty is not every country in the world has signed the Refugee Convention. Of course, if you sign an international convention with an obligation of non-refoulement, that's in no way a violation of your sovereignty, because that's an obligation you've undertaken freely by joining that treaty. But there is a strong argument that the principle of non-refoulement is also a principle of customary international law, so that even states who haven't signed up recognise a duty not to push people back. And I think that is where your comment about does the pandemic make a difference is relevant, because I think there is general agreement that states do recognise an obligation of non-refoulement. Whether they've signed the Refugee Convention or not, they get the idea that there's something wrong with pushing people back to persecution. But it is, I think, been argued by many scholars that that obligation is perhaps not regarded by states as absolute. So they would say that there are circumstances in which they can close their borders, and they might well use extreme public health as an example. I think they would struggle if they were a state receiving small numbers of refugees, because states are still open to travellers and refugees could be quarantined just as anyone else could be quarantined. A state might have a stronger argument if you had a very large movement of tens of thousands of people across its border in the middle of a pandemic. The problem is that UNHCR has an advisory role. There is no court that determines what the Refugee Convention means and what the obligations are. The International Court of Justice could look at it if one state took another state to that court, but people in glass houses generally don't throw stones, so states aren't in the habit of taking other states to court about their treatment of refugees. Their treatment of their own nationals, perhaps. We've just seen the Rohingya case, but treatment of refugees, everyone tends to keep a bit quiet. So we had the European Court of Human Rights in a case called Hirshijama against Italy say that no, Italy couldn't deliberately intercept boats on the high seas so they didn't get into territorial waters and push those boats back to Libyan waters, land them in Libya, where you've also got an interesting mixture of the obligations under the Refugee Convention with the obligations under the Convention on the Law of the Sea to rescue people and take them to a place of safety. European Court on Human Rights said, no, it isn't all right to head them off before they get into your territorial waters. But we will find that the US Supreme Court, in a case called Saleh and the Haitian Centers Council, took a different view and said the Refugee Convention isn't extraterritorial. And there is nowhere where those differing interpretations are likely to meet.
Yeah, you've brought again up this very interesting issue about how international law is domesticated. So, there is a question about the application of international law, first of all, which is reasonably technical, we don't want to get into, but certainly when you're looking at the US, and Alex mentioned, and you both mentioned this issue of the Haitians, this disparate treatment between Haitian refugees and Cuban refugees is very striking. Cubans generally, as soon as they touch American soil, are granted resident rights, whereas Haitians will be pushed back and won't even have their applications in many instances examined, therefore giving rise to a potential non-refoulement problem. And America's perspective would be that international law is not the law of the United States, and they will apply first and foremost their own domestic law. So there is a problem of interpretation, of course, and we can see it too at the European level. Alex, I want to ask you specifically about some of the issues in the camps, looking, what is happening right now, how they're coping. I know that you've been in touch with a number of people who are working directly for organisations in the camp as part of the Refugee Studies Centre. Do you want to talk a bit about what's sort of going on right now in those camps?
So, one of the things worth saying as well is that the majority of the world's refugees are no longer actually in camps. 61% of the world's refugees are now living in cities. And the sort of turning point for that was in 2006, which was the first year the majority of the world's refugees were actually in cities, not just big capital cities, but also often secondary cities. But there's variation from region to region. So in the African context, the number and proportion living in refugees is smaller than in other regions, and actually camps are still a very big and overwhelming proportion of the places where refugees are living. And a lot of the research I do is focused on East Africa, Uganda, Kenya, Ethiopia, and particularly in Kenya and traditionally in Ethiopia, there's been a strong emphasis on encampment for refugees, insisting that they live in designated areas. So in those countries, the overwhelming majority of refugees do live in and have to live in camps. And camps, of course, in some ways have been insulated from the effects of the virus. And that's because they're often geographically remote, they're socially not networked in the same way cities are. And so certainly in the East African region, the impact of the actual virus has been relatively low in terms of the numbers of people diagnosed. But there have been other significant problems, problems of misinformation, problems of fear. The international community has also stepped away in some senses. Senior international staff have often gone back to Geneva or to wherever they come from. There have been real strains on resources. So health facilities at the best of times are stretched to breaking point in refugee camp contexts. And so there's been a real pressure to mobilize resources to contexts that have already been underfunded to meet these additional needs. Now, one of the really striking things, particularly in camps, but also in cities in those countries that we've seen, is the response of refugees themselves. That by default, as NGO capacity, as international organization capacity is diminished, it's refugees themselves that have often stepped into that gap and been the first responders to immediate needs, both the public health needs, but also the social service needs where there have been gaps. And we've seen, for instance, refugee-led organizations, of which there are many, many operating in camps and cities around the world, often below the radar, often without access to international funding, often without recognition, really stepping up to the fore to provide forms of support. So we've seen organizations in camps like the Kakuma refugee camp in Kenya, like many of the settlements in Uganda, providing services like sewing face masks, providing additional support for food distribution, providing community support around public information. So what's been really remarkable is to sort of document those refugee-led responses. And we've had a seminar series at the Refugee Studies Centre where we've actually been called #ByRefugees, refugee-led responses to the pandemic. And we've heard from many of those refugee-led organisations about what's been going on in the camps and the ways in which they've responded proactively to some of those needs to fill immediate gaps. And it's very inspiring to sort of see that initiative, and that refugees, despite vulnerabilities, often have enormous capacities to support other refugees within their community. But that is a reflection of diminished humanitarian capacity and weaknesses appearing in the humanitarian response in camps. And just in parentheses next to that, it's worth saying that in the cities, the challenge has been that traditionally there is no adequate assistance model, that it really is only the most vulnerable of the vulnerable that get any international assistance whatsoever. So the camps as the main assistance environment have been challenged. In cities, there have been a very different set of challenges.
Thank you. And I'm glad you mentioned, as well as issues, obvious issues such as food, healthcare, clean water, accommodation, but this whole issue around access to information, good information, and IT, something that we absolutely take for granted and we couldn't do without in the pandemic, but is something which is not available to a very large number of refugees. I'm going to take some questions now. We've got some excellent questions and put those to you. So there's a question, I think, Alison, you might want to answer this one first. Are there special considerations for children who are asylum seekers?
You have two types of child asylum seeker. You have the child who is traveling with their family and the child who is alone and unaccompanied. The Refugee Convention doesn't create special obligations. The obligation of non-refoulement is for everybody. But there are other obligations derived from both international law, regional law. The European Union, for example, has a very strong framework of child rights to try to put extra protection around children. One of the issues I'm looking at the moment, for example, is the question of statelessness for children of refugees. Children are moving, they're perhaps being born in a country that they are just transiting through. They're often coming from countries where women can't transmit their nationality to children born overseas. Only the father can do that, but the father's not with them, or missing, or dead, or they don't have papers and lose papers. The Convention on the Rights of the Child provides that a child's birth should be registered and the child should have a nationality. So that obligation then kicks in from the side, as it were, rather than the Refugee Convention. In general, in domestic law, you will find special protection for children, and in the international and regional instruments on children's rights.
Yes, and I think there's also been different kind of procedural legislation, procedural standards in place when taking evidence from children, and the way that they're treated in appeal hearings and that sort of thing. But I think it's also fair to say that the thinking around this has moved, has shifted, and that I think in the UK at least, there is, I think, a better understanding now, not least with some more stronger domestic legislation about putting the best interests of the child right up there as a primary consideration. Alex, a question which is for you. People who've grown up, this is from Roger Mann, people who've grown up as refugees often find it difficult to access employment and education opportunities offered to them because they lack proof of identity and other requisite paperwork. What, if anything, might governments do to either domestically or internationally amend law and regulation to ameliorate such barriers? This was a recurring theme in the RSC webinar series.
So a big part of my research is focusing on the economic lives of refugees and trying to really recognize that the common perception that refugees are an inevitable burden is misplaced. That yes, they often do have vulnerabilities, but they have capabilities and can make a contribution socioeconomically and otherwise. But one of the big barriers is often the absence of the right to work. The right to work is unavailable in many low and middle income host countries. And even in rich countries like many European countries, there are initial restrictions on the right to work for asylum seekers. Now, in some parts of Europe, that's a 3-month restriction. In some, it's 6. In some, it's 9. In some, it's 12. But either they have to wait for a certain period of time while they're asylum seekers, or to become refugees in order to get that right to work. And around the world, where you're in countries that don't have the formal right to work, of course, refugees still have economic lives. They consume, they produce, they borrow, they lend, they buy, they sell. But a lot of those economic activities are in the informal economy, where refugees face lower wages for the same work compared to host country citizens, where they're vulnerable to exploitation. And that has a real effect, particularly for refugees in cities, where they're very vulnerable to the worst aspects of the informal economy. But also in the rich world, there are enormous consequences to even the lag to get access to work. There are also other informal restrictions or other forms of barriers to labour market access, recognition of qualifications. We have many highly skilled refugees who arrive with a background that is professional, but their degree certificates or qualifications are often not recognised. And we've seen, for instance, during the pandemic, many refugees who have a background as health workers, as nurses, doctors even, who have struggled to be recognised as having the capacity and capability to contribute to, for instance, our National Health Service. Now, at a time when we're stretched to the limit and we need all the health capacity we can get, that's really unfortunate. There are people with skills, talents, and aspirations in every part of the world who happen to be refugees, and we're locking them out of making a contribution. And there's an economic irrationality to that before we even get to the question of what it means for those people. In refugee camps around the world, many people are there not just for a couple of years during an emergency phase, but they're there in what are called protracted refugee situations, situations that last more than 5 years, in which people are stuck in limbo. Many refugees are there for 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. And if the best education most people get in such a context is primary education, and then there's no prospect of legal work, we're warehousing people. We're wasting that talent. And to a lesser degree, I think there are other barriers that we impose in rich parts of the world that equally waste talent and potential contribution. So we've got to sort out our regulation, our legislation, and remove many of the informal barriers.
Great, thank you. And a different question, and Alison, I think, well, possibly for both of you, but the definition, what is the definition of persecution? And specifically, are women in Saudi Arabia who wish to act autonomously but are not allowed to being persecuted? This is from Hugh Carnegie. So, I mean, it could be, one could think of the example of a woman who wanted to freely marry a person that she chose to, or perhaps wanted to freely work but wasn't allowed to. Does that amount to persecution, or is the threshold for persecution something higher? Does it amount to actual abuse? Alison, do you want to?
There's no definition in the convention, so the meaning of persecution has been built up incrementally by courts and commentary from leading scholars. Professor Hathaway in Canada has been very keen, particularly to map human rights standards onto the way people's rights are violated, and say when you've got non-derogable rights, such as the prohibition on torture, a violation of that will amount to persecution. When you're looking at balancing rights, such as the right to private and family life or the right to freedom of association, then you have to weigh up the seriousness, how grave is the violation in your case. In the case of the woman prohibited from work, question one is, what happens if you do work? Do you get killed? Do you get told off? Do you lose your job? Are there other further consequences? So you look at the severity of the harm that someone faces. There is also a line of jurisprudence which first emerged in cases of gay asylum seekers, which said if your choice is to hide your sexual identity or get killed, and you would be someone who hid your identity, are you a refugee? And the Supreme Court in the UK, which I think set a standard that many other courts around the world have copied, said in that circumstance, you are a refugee because your sexual identity is such an intrinsic part of you that to require you to deny it at that penalty would be persecution. And the courts have built on that subsequently. So they've looked at political opinion. What if you are in Zimbabwe and forced to profess support to a regime when you're apolitical? You don't care, but you face being killed if you don't chant your support for the regime. And they have said in those circumstances, freedom of opinion includes freedom not to have one, and you would be persecuted. So I think we're looking at the question of what are the sanctions for not working? If the woman says, well, because of those sanctions, I'm not going to work, do we think that the ability to engage in employment is a sufficiently intrinsic part of your fundamental rights that to violate it would be a violation of it to force you just to not protest and keep quiet and get back into the kitchen? So it will be built up on a case-by-case basis. It took a most ridiculous amount of time in this country to work out that the persecution of women was the persecution of a social group. You'd have thought it was fairly obvious. What are men and women two distinct groups in society? Yes, I think you can argue there are more than two groups, but they're certainly not the same group. And it took a ridiculous amount of time to get that sorted in our law, because the Refugee Convention only protects when you are persecuted for a convention reason, race, religion, nationality, political opinion, or this strange creature, membership of a social group. And that would be where you would go with your women in Saudi.
Yeah, it highlights this issue of certain categories of people who are very much, well, who don't obviously fall into refugee convention protection, but nevertheless may be protected under international human rights law, at least in Europe. So, I mean, somebody fleeing climate change, there is an argument certainly that they might be protected by the Refugee Convention, but it's hard. It's much easier to argue it from a human rights perspective. Or people who are fleeing armed conflict. Again, that per se doesn't give rise to a convention reason for persecution, but maybe protection.
I would say with climate change refugees, that always raises my hackles, because either your particular vulnerability to the effects of climate change is caused by politics, by the fact that you are the people whose race, religion, ethnicity generally receives the least protection. So as resources get scarcer, that's nothing different to ordinary refugees. Most refugees are in that position, that they are, as with the pandemic, they are differentially affected by bad things that happen. If you are affected solely by a natural disaster, so your island gets smaller through nobody's fault, that isn't persecution, because persecution is instrumental. There's an intentionality there. So I think people get so confused about climate change. You're either looking at refugees, where the reason that they have been harmed is because climate change has made resources scarce. I worked in Darfur. There's an argument that Darfur is about lack of water and famine, and that an ordinary migration of nomads and fighting between nomads and pastoralists was exploited by a government when resources became scarce as climate changed. But I think we have to be very careful not to create a new category of climate change refugees.
I think Alex wants to come in last.
I think the challenge here is that the drafters of the 1951 Convention on the Status of Refugees that created that refugee definition that you started with, Alison, they envisaged that the interpretation of that definition could change over time. It was recognized that we could have expanding jurisprudence in the thinking of courts and bureaucracies over time so that it would adapt to changing circumstances. But as you say, jurisprudence moves remarkably slowly, and it varies dramatically across jurisdictions. So one country's view on whether generalized violence represents a form of persecution, whether non-state actors can be perpetrators of persecution, those questions, particularly over the last decades, have been interpreted differently in different jurisdictions by particular courts, by particular bureaucracies. And then you get inconsistencies which emerge and broaden over time. And I think that the challenge at the moment is the drivers of displacement are changing rapidly. And so many people who are displaced and have really serious human rights violations, or indeed face significant deprivations, are not fleeing obvious instrumentalized acts by the governments of their countries of origin. They're in fragile and failed states in which it's often the inaction of weak governments that drives them to have to leave because of serious socioeconomic rights deprivations, because of armed gangs, as in the Central American context, because of food insecurity, increasingly water insecurity. And I suppose the thing about climate change is it's going to drive inevitably, albeit that the numbers are uncertain, much greater displacement. The World Bank has estimated an additional close to 150 million internally displaced people by 2050 as a result of climate change. Now, climate change cannot be a persecuting actor for the reasons you alluded to. And yet, there are clear issues of the human rights of people affected by climate change. And some of those, as the UN Human Rights Committee has acknowledged, could potentially be considered to have a right to non-refoulement. Now, they're not refugees in the 1951 Convention definition, and they won't be. But the question we all face is how we fill that gap between the provisions of the 1951 Convention and the definition of persecution on the one hand, and the changing and proliferating drivers of forced displacement in the contemporary world.
Totally agree with that.
Sort of ended in a way on a perfect note to begin another whole series on how we you push forward the convention, how you reinterpret it to take into account new and dynamic situations. We have run out of time, and apologies if we didn't get to your question, but it's been a huge pleasure to be in conversation with both of you, Alison and Alex, and thank you again to Somerville for putting this evening on, and I do hope you will continue in this format post-lockdown for those of us who can't easily get to the lovely spires of Oxford. Thank you all, stay well and good evening.